Well, hello and welcome to another Restore Live on Monday evening. And normally on Monday evening, it's about Northern Ireland. It's about Northern Ireland unionism and talking to people right across the province of Northern Ireland. But as you know, what we do is that we also share into Restore GBNI. And if you're from anywhere else in the United Kingdom, stay with us. You're welcome, because tonight we're speaking to a man, a Professor Jon Tonge from the University of Liverpool. And it's always good to talk to the people, the experts, the academics, and to try to scratch the surface to understand. Sometimes that people like us, we're not quite up to speed with certain things, and it's always good to be able to ask questions to the likes of Jon Tonge, and we'll get proper answers. And sometimes that we can take those answers and we can use those answers to negotiate our way in the future. Tonight, really what we're here to do is we're here to scratch the surface and talk about a few things. Recently, we've had Brexit I mean, personally, I believe that it was Brexit in name only. And, I mean, I come from the standpoint that whenever that you put your axe on a democratic referendum or a democratic ballot paper, I mean, when is it ever right for one section of a vote or one people's vote not to register in the same way that everyone else's did? And what am I saying? I'm saying that in England and Scotland and in Wales, well, you see, their vote had been registered in a different way than the people of Northern Ireland. So, I mean, is it ever right? And this is what we want to ask Jon Tonge. Is it ever right that in democracy, when you exercise your democracy, is it ever right that the powers that be, they decide that some people's democracy isn't as worthy as another's? But that's something, as I say, that we'd like to speak to John about as the show goes on. So we're not really going to waste too much time this evening. What we're going to do is we're nearly going to get straight down to it. So I would just like to play a little video clip here. And this little video clip, it'll set in context, I guess, something that we're going to start really talking about. And, John, just a few years ago, I'm saying just a few years ago, well, it's a few country years, like a country mile. I think it was 1990, actually, that John and several other people, they wrote a book about Northern Ireland. And if you'd have been with us on Friday night when Councillor Billy Hutchison was here, well, you see, Billy Hutchison had said to mention to John that, that Billy went and he helped launch the book. And so what we've done is we've looked into the book. I've had a quick conversation with John with reference to the book. And I think that this book was written, I'm just going to try to get a cover of the copy here for 2 seconds, but I think that the book was written really to talk to people, to scratch the surface, and John will be able to tell you more about it. But what they did was that whenever there was ceasefires back in 1994 by various paramilitary groupings here in Northern Ireland, well, sort of 6 years later in 1990, well, John and his team, his colleagues, they interviewed lots of people, and I think they were asking, well, let's look at the cover of the book, and we'll explain from there. But they called it Abandoning the Historical Conflict and Former Paramilitary Prisoners and Political Reconciliation in Northern Ireland. And I think that just about says it all. But I mean, I'm not really steal John's thunder, and that will come into that book, I suppose, as we get on with the show. So I'm just going to play a little video. And this video, what I want to do is I want to get straight into it, into the cut and thrust of things. And then whenever we get over this section of the show, what we'll do is we'll begin to explore with John what a professor of politics actually does. What's his remit? I mean, what is it that he does in his everyday life? And, is John a useful man to know? And I believe that academics are useful people to know, and especially if they know the ins and outs of politics, and especially like tonight, like I'm going to ask them the question, why is my democracy not registering in the same way as people in England and Scotland and in Wales? And we hope to get an answer of that. But anyway, here we go with a little video, and I would like for the people to just try to understand the words in this video. And you'll know by now that what we do is that we play these types of videos at the start of every show, just really to give us some context and something to speak about. But this one's a whopper by any stretch of the imagination. So here we go with the little video.
We have taken a lot of big initiatives and a lot of big moves in the last couple of years. We have attacked the Orange State. Whatever we think about policing them, we all think different things. The RUC are destroyed. The Orange Order are in their backs. The dance throws that they have are going year by year by year. The civil service is under assault from us. The Southern State is collapsing, it's falling apart.
Some very strong words there in that little video clip. And if you look there, I mean, there's two sections of that video that I'm particularly interested in. And number one, that that the civil service is under assault by the IRA. Now that's a very serious allegation, or not allegation, but admission from Bobby Story, and that was only just a few years ago. And it's sort of confirming what a lot of people had thought for a very, very long time. So I take my hat off to the man that actually uncovered that video and that clip, and thank you very much. And then the next thing that he says that the southern state is on the verge of collapse. That was something else, John. And I think whenever you and I spent some time recently at an Orange Order or certainly a marching band parade, whenever you had some interest in that and you came to see it, that we talked about really the arguments for and against, say, a so-called United Ireland. And as I said to you, I mean, I placed the some financial arguments that could be made. And I'm going to give an example here. Well, if you take Dublin, say, and you take Belfast, and then you take the distance between the two areas, and then if you come the same distance from Dublin, say back as far as maybe Drogheda, and then you do exactly the same from Belfast, and you can maybe down as far as Banbridge. And then what you do is you try to establish the cost of housing, for example. And you'll find that, say, for example, in Drogheda, so much away from the capital, which was Dublin, you might pay somewhere in the region of maybe 12, 13, 1400 euro for an ordinary semi-detached house just to rent it out. And then if you go into, Banbridge, it might be maybe £650. And when the euro stands almost in an equivalency to the pound, you can just see straight away that the cost of living in the south is extreme. Now, granted that the wages in the south is also a wee bit more than what it would be here in Northern Ireland, but I have to say the extra wages doesn't make up for the extra costs in the south. So that's something that I would like to get into further down the show here, John. But John, that's Bobby's story, and there's some harsh, like some extreme admissions there from Bobby's story. And I'm going to say something, but I can remember standing on the Shankill Road in 1993, and I can remember looking at the aftermath of the Shankill bomb. And I can remember thinking, I had some friends that I lost in there, some very, very good friends. And I mean, like a man as close as a brother. He was killed in the bomb himself and his wife and his young child. And I remember looking at that and I thought to myself that this has to stop, because people are recognizing no boundaries on the depths that they're prepared to stoop to get one over in the other community. And something, the only people we're losing was exactly that, was the people. And it was the people on both sides, because those atrocities were visited to and from and over and across each divide, and that was a real problem. Now, I would say that there was a great, desire for peace in 1993. And remember at that time, there was a lot of talk about the pending Downing Street Declaration that was to come. And then the ceasefires were delivered by the paramilitaries in 1994 by both the Republicans, and then the Loyalists actually followed suit. So there was actually a desire for peace. Now, there were skeptics at the time, and some of the skeptics basically, there were people trying to explain to them what would be in it for everyone if everybody laid down their arms and if they went for peace. Now, the change for me would have been is that I genuinely thought that, that even Republicans at that time would have maybe, been through all this conflict and would have had a great desire to try to put the past behind them. And as Bill Clinton says at the Belfast City Hall in 1995, you can place the past behind you, and you can reach out to the other community, and you can make amends for the bitterness and the hatred of the past. But that wasn't the way that it went, because not long after Bill Clinton standing at the Belfast City Hall in December of 1995, the IRA let off a bomb on early 1996, the Canary Wharf bomb, it was known as, and that caused £500 million worth of damage. Now, it was clear cut, it was the IRA had done it. I mean, Bill Clinton's, if you look back at some of the books, Bill Clinton's advisors were being told about it in Clonard Monastery, whilst Bill Clinton was at Macnic's factory talking up peace. And, from the like of me, I mean, I looked at it at that point in time and I just thought to myself, these people are not serious. These people are going to try to use this to extract concessions. And so they did. So for a lot of people from in January of 1996, whenever that Canary Wharf happened, in my honest opinion and other people's opinions, The peace process from then on in became what's known as an appeasement process. John, welcome to the screen. Sorry for the long introduction, but there's just a few things to get us started on. And, I'd like to ask you at this stage, okay, so Jon Tonge, Professor of Politics from the University of Liverpool, what is it that a professor of politics does, John? That's the first question for you.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a tricky one to answer. Basically, professor of politics researches politics. In my case, British, Northern Irish, and Irish politics. Publishes books and articles on those, mainly on those topics. I do go further afield into comparative peace processes, further, looking around the globe at peace processes. We teach for some of the time, probably about 30% of the time we're teaching students. So I teach British politics, I teach comparative peace processes, and I teach devolution across the UK. And some of the time we're doing pretty boring administrative jobs, which are about delivery teaching. So it's three elements in professional research: what you publish, what you teach, and your admin. It's being paid for your observation, really. I mean, I couldn't probably hold down a real job. Far better. I've always been interested in politics from a very early age, and to get paid well for doing the research that I want to do is great. I wouldn't wish another job. Never wanted another job.
Yeah. John, we talked about, I'd done some research there and was just looking back, and it wasn't too hard to find some of the things that you've been involved in your day. And one of the things that sort of really stuck out in my mind, and it's because that I see this particular thing happening right now, and it has happened in the South, but you were involved in some sort of youth forum, and I think from my recollection, you've told me that the Labour Party had engaged you to become part of that. Could you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, the Labour government was concerned about falling election turnout amongst young people, which is a problem that has not been addressed. Only a minority of young people have voted in the last 6 general elections, which is a pretty damning indictment of our political system, that young people, by which I mean 18 to 24-year-olds, if they don't vote, then frankly, I think it's bad news for politics. So Gordon Brown asked, probably in charge of the Youth Citizenship Commission, as it was known, which was a sort of 18-month, 2-year investigation into how to better connect young people to politics, how to make them better citizens by getting involved in politics. Because when people were asked what makes you a good citizen, and this was the first commission was chaired by Lord Goldsmith, people talked about helping your neighbour, which is good citizenship, obviously. Doing jury service, those sort of things. Very few people mention voting, and yet surely voting is an act of citizenship, an important act of citizenship. It's a real problem in Northern Ireland. We looked at Northern Ireland, obviously, as part of the study. Only 1 in 3 18 to 24-year-olds have voted at the last 3 Northern Ireland general elections. That's worse than anywhere else in the UK. But my fear was that we didn't solve the problems, partly because the report, although the Labour government responded to it, Gordon Brown was ousted by David Cameron not long after we concluded our recommendations. And I don't think the Conservative government was as interested, particularly as Gordon Brown had also asked to look at whether the voting age should be lowered to 16, which the Commission was divided on. Personally, I don't support votes at 16 because I don't think we get enough political education in schools to get young enough people, get people at 16 and 17 sufficiently informed. But vote to 16 obviously has gone ahead for non-general elections in Scotland and Wales. It's not an issue that's going to go away. Just at that time, we didn't feel that we could recommend it, which I think disappointed him, because I think he was looking for votes by 2000.
Yeah, I understand. And the reason why that I mentioned it, John, was I would just like to say to the live chat, there's a couple of people saying about some voice speech here breaking up. But if it continues to break up, just continue to let us know, because it's coming through on my side okay right now. And then what we will do is, I say, if it continues to go, well, I can talk for a bit. John can actually dislodge and come back in again. Sometimes turning it on, turning it back off again, it actually helps. John, the reason why that I sort of focused in on the youth assembly that you were involved in, I think you were the chairman of it. Is that right? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
was because, I mean, I've been looking at and watching what citizens' assemblies been doing in other parts of the world. And, I mean, I'm going to be straight with you. I'm not going to put any gloss on it, but I kind of see it as a corruption of democracy in many more ways than one. And, let's explain to you about what happened in Southern Ireland just quite recently. Was that, the Citizens' Assembly, as far as I understand it, in the south was a group of 100 people taken from across a broad, a broad spectrum of society, let's just say. And, and they bring them into a room. Just tell me if to stop if I'm wrong here, and you can correct me as I go, but they bring them to a forum. And what happens is that then, I think maybe people like yourselves come along, academics, and there's maybe a subject that is chosen, and then you would give different takes on the fors and against and the do's and the don'ts, and then the citizens then in the assembly, they make up their mind as to which way they'll vote. Is that the way that it works, those citizens assemblies?
Yeah, I mean, the Youth Citizenship Commission that I chaired was different. It wasn't an assembly. It's important to stress that. It was Gordon Brown appointed 20 people, of which I was chair, to look as a commission to look at the issues, but we didn't operate as an assembly. I know what you mean about the South, where basically, you've got a citizens' assembly for very difficult issues, a representative sample, 100 people looking at, and obviously in the South you had abortion being looked at, and in the South they recommended that abortion should be permitted up to 12 weeks. And that was, it should be said, I mean, I was, like yourself, John, I was skeptical about citizens' assemblies, but in the South, in terms of abortion, you can argue it did work in the sense that when what that assembly recommended was put to the people, there was a big vote in favour in the South, in favour of liberalising abortion to a certain extent. So you can't say that assembly was unrepresentative. It did seem representative of where people lay on an issue. It's a way of breaking, I suppose, the logjam on very, very difficult issues, which obviously, abortion is a sensitive issue. So I can see the value of citizens' assemblies. I do wonder, though, in the North, whether, what you could put a citizens' assembly to. What logjam would it break in Northern Ireland? And that's where I would question it a bit more, because inevitably you're going to get, given the nature of Northern Ireland, you're going to get sectarian divisions within the 100 people that you choose.
Yeah, absolutely. And whenever I looked at, at the minute, I think that we have the Citizens' Assembly in its embryonic form right now in Northern Ireland. And in fact, it was agreed there not too long ago. And I think they're calling it the Youth Forum or the Youth Assembly, or they've given it some glossy words. But what I fear, John, with these citizens' assemblies, and I'm just going to be straight with you, is that who chooses who's on the assemblies? The scrutiny isn't really up to challenge at the end of the day. And and I would say, and this is me being straight with you, I'm generally conservative, as is many of my friends, and that's the politics that we espouse. But what happens is that, you wouldn't get voices like mine, I would say, on those citizens' assemblies, and they'll be chosen in a way.
It'll be chosen by random, as it was in the South. You basically, it's a ballot. You're chosen at random, and then it's weighted. So it's representative of the population in terms of age. So you've got a good age spread. You've got a gender. You've got equal number of men and women. It's not like, I know where you're going. I know what you mean. It's like when the Good Friday Agreement was introduced, and they had the civic forum set up, in which you had all sort of societal worthies put on this 60-member civic forum. But that wasn't a random sample of the population. That was just people who were deemed socially acceptable. So other groups were marginalised. They weren't allowed on the civic forum, like the Orange Order, which does represent still a reasonable amount of people. So I agree. You can't, it's got to be a random sample of the population that is representative of the population as a whole. Otherwise, what's the point? You can't. It's no good loading it up with 95% of people who've already made up their mind. It's supposed to be a deliberative assembly of people genuinely weighing up a difficult issue and making their mind up.
Yeah, I would like to be on the panel that chooses the people, salting through and just trying to understand, is it a genuine makeup? But look, again, we talked about, John, that, I mean, you were involved in that setup, and I mean, there was merits in setting something like that up. And you just mentioned the fact that not very many of the kids nowadays, they're voting, and it's a way of getting them interested, I guess, in politics. And for that reason, I mean, it's got to be a good thing. But I just worry that where it goes, as I say, that if left or if put in the wrong hands. And I do notice that there's some characters that fund things, you know, and they don't get a very good name, but they've gone all out into funding these things to try to make them become a reality. And I just know that their thoughts aren't on all the goodness that can come out of them type of things. John, whenever you said there that there's not that many people getting involved in politics, and you said that, you know, and that's because we have no political education in schools. Now, I'm going to say to you that in the South, I know that there's this thing called civic, social, political education. I mean, do we have that nowadays in the UK? And if not, why not?
Yeah, you have it in different forms in different countries. You've got citizenship education in England, but that tends to be whatever the teacher frankly fancies talking about on any particular day. It's been a bit of a Cinderella subject, citizenship education. No one really knows what its purpose is. And, you know, GCSE and A-level citizenship qualifications are not held in high regard. Michael Gove wanted to scrap it. He did back off scrapping the subject, but it's not held in high esteem because no one really knows what it's trying to do. In Scotland, you've got civics, which and modern studies, which is held in slightly greater esteem. It's different again in Wales, and it's different again in Northern Ireland. So there's not a UK-wide concept of citizenship education. It takes different forms in different parts of the UK. Obviously, there's some people who would be very sceptical of it anyway, because people would say, well, hang on, it's teachers, and teachers tend to be left-wing. So you don't want them filling the kids' heads with, you know, left-wing politics. Yeah. But what we're talking about is really more about the pragmatic stuff in terms of, you know, voting and the history of voting and the suffragettes and why we vote, rather than, you know, filling people's heads with doctrinaire views, because I'd be totally against that as well. It's about maybe a GCSE in politics, just so that people understand the system. Because if you ask people to identify the difference between first past the post as a voting system and proportional representation, how many kids would actually go and be able to answer that? You know, how many adults will be able to answer that? And yet, you know, we're going to let them vote at 18, 16. You've got a situation now in Scotland. It's only a few years ago, 16 and 17-year-olds were voting on the independence of their country. That's a massively important vote. And yet, on the other hand, the paradox is those same 16, 17-year-olds couldn't go out and buy a pint. They couldn't go out and buy a firework to celebrate or commiserate on the result of the independence referendum. So I think we've got to decide at what age do you become an adult. That's the first thing to say. The reason of voting, the UK was the first country in the world to lower the voting age from 21 to 18, way back at the end of the 1960s. That's because people felt you were an adult at 18. But I don't think people do think that 16-year-olds are adults, because they're banned from doing lots of things. So what I want to hear is the case for votes at 16, because it's yet to convince me, having looked at this issue for a number of years. But I do think it's an important issue. I think it's an issue that won't go away, given the Scots and the Welsh have gone for votes at 16. In Northern Ireland, it's not a Stormont matter. Stormont doesn't have the power to lower the voting age. Only the Westminster government can do that, which again is anomalous. You know, parking the rights and wrongs of votes at 16 for a moment. It's strange that Scotland has the power. It's strange that Wales has the power, but Northern Ireland doesn't have the power to determine at what age a citizen should have the right to vote.
Yeah, and that's probably a good thing. John, before we move on with the Northern Ireland stuff, and we'll sort of get into the book, why you wrote the book, who it was that you were speaking to, and as I say, that Billy Hutchison mentioned that he was at the book launch for you. I would just like to play a little video clip here from a man in the Parliament not too long ago, and he's talking about really that protest is the oxygen of democracy. And he said that if you lose the oxygen of anything, well, you know, what happens? It dies, it withers, and you're the best man to talk to about this, given that you're the professor, you're the man with the credentials. So I'd just like to play this video, and then we'll come back and I'll ask you a few questions on the video.
Sir Charles Walker, Madam Deputy Speaker, our freedoms are like the air we breathe. They're fundamental to us as a nation and to who we are as its people. We are not asking our constituents to do anything we have never asked. We have coerced them. We have criminalised freedom of association, the freedom to go about one's business, the freedom to travel, and the freedom to protest. The freedom to protest. That is the oxygen of democracy. Our fundamental rights are our contract with government. I am living in fear of something much darker hiding in the shadows. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, when the sunlight returns, and it will return, I hope it chases those shadows away. But I can't be sure that it will. I cannot be sure. And that is at the heart of my anxiety and the anxiety of so many of the people I represent in this place.
John, I would just like to ask you a question based on what you've just heard there. But, you know, protest, the right to protest is the oxygen of democracy. Now, we do understand that there's COVID restrictions in place right now. And we do understand that, you know, that there's got to be restrictions put in a lot of things. And we see that happening right across the board. But if that is the case, and if the right to protest against any of these unpalatable decisions have been put in place, I mean, should any decisions then be abandoned for now until such times as that right to protest comes about again?
Well, I think that the key issue on freedom, that Charles Walker, the MP that you had in the clip there, the key issue is whether those freedoms will be restored. People might accept a suppression of their freedoms on a temporary basis of a temporary medical emergency, in the same way that in World War II, people accepted you had to put the lights out. You had wardens coming around telling you to put the lights out, and you had to have identity cards, you had to have rationing for food. People accepted a suppression of their freedoms on a temporary basis. What does concern me is whether our freedoms will fully return. Provided that they do, I don't have a major problem with it. I can still be slightly skeptical about whether lockdowns work, because, you know, we've had masks, we've had lockdowns, they don't seem to work. That would be my criticism of it, although the question begged would be how much worse things could be without them. The big question is, okay, let's hope and pray the vaccines work, in which case people should not be dying en masse from coronavirus. There will still be some deaths. Will our freedoms return then? Because I don't want to spend a life of sitting 2 meters away from people. I don't want to spend a lifetime wearing masks, going into shops, and I suspect most other people don't either. But if you look at public support for lockdown, public support for taking away our freedoms on a temporary basis, at least, it looks pretty solid. It looks about 2 to 1 if you look at the survey on it. So ultimately, our freedoms are contingent. If you've got a medical emergency, in which case you can pass on a deadly virus to people, I think people will accept the suppression of their freedoms, provided that it is temporary and provided it is lifted once the crisis is lifted. I think that's the key issue there.
Yeah. I mean, again, you're the expert on democracy, given that you're the professor of politics. And on the democracy, I mean, let's take, for example, the recent Brexit referendum. And we noticed that Northern Ireland was separated from the rest of the UK, albeit on an economic way. And they called it divergence, is exactly what they called it. And again, that was something that the people of Northern Ireland couldn't actually go and protest against, or you know. And I mean, if protest is the oxygen of democracy, I mean, is that still valid, that people didn't have a chance to actually protest?
The only reason you can't have street protests at the moment is because of the COVID emergency. And I have some sympathy for those who want to protest, because, you know, the quicker we get rid of this emergency, the better, in which case I would expect to see visible protest. Going back to your introduction to the whole programme, you talked about Rhino for Northern Ireland, Brexit in name only. I would agree with you. It is Brexit in name only. Northern Ireland has been treated very differently according to the terms of the referendum outcome. Now, the strong counter argument is Northern Ireland voted to remain, It was a UK-wide referendum, though, so I get why a Brexiteer from Northern Ireland would complain about the terms of departure that have been inflicted upon Northern Ireland. And I get why a loyalist or a unionist would be unhappy with a border in the Irish Sea, because it does create the embryonic economic United Ireland that people have talked about. It does create trade barriers between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I don't think it's the disaster for loyalism or unionism that a lot of loyalists and unionists think, though, whether it be, Jamie Bryson's been very vocal about it. The DUP are opposed to this form of Brexit. The UUP are opposed to it. There's no guarantee that because you set up an economic United Ireland, which I think is a substantial shift towards that. There's no guarantee, John, that will lead to a change in people's constitutional outlook. It might happen, but it's not guaranteed. We've not been picking up. We've done the last 4 general election surveys. 2 were pre-Brexit and 2 were post-Brexit. We've not found that unionists have been going over wholesale to become nationalists who want a united Ireland. What we found is an increase in constitutional agnosticism. So there's a section, if you want to use the religious labels, there's a section of the Protestant population which is now sort of indifferent to the notion of a united Ireland, whereas once upon a time they might have opposed it very vociferously. But that's partly because the nature of the South has changed considerably. It's not automatic that because you've set up an economic united Ireland that will lead to a constitutional united Ireland. It might happen, but that'll be, I think, more about demographic change rather than what has happened in terms of Brexit. Because I think if this does work, if Northern Ireland can trade okay with the South and trade with the big UK internal market, things would be okay. And then in which case, if you're happy with it, would you vote for constitutional change? Yeah. I'm not sure that people will.
Yeah, absolutely. And then given what Bobby Story was saying there, he says that the South is about to collapse, and that's from a Republican standpoint, talking about that he aspires to.
Okay, well, just coming back on what Bobby Story said, I think the context is important. I'm not sure the date that Bobby Story gave that speech, but I suspect it was in the sort of heading up to ceasefire years. I could be wrong on this.
It was actually on the run up to the, he talked about 30 years after the hunger strike, so 1980 and 30 years on, really. So okay. It was, yeah.
So we're talking 2011, it was 30 years. Yeah. Look, he's got it. He was saying to the pro Republican faithful, we've achieved loads, which you've got to, because obviously United Ireland have not been achieved, but he's got to highlight to them the gains that they have made. So it's about selling peace to what was once a sceptical Republican constituency, which, we saw the splinter in the IRA in 1997. So what Bobby Story's doing there is reassuring the base that there hasn't been a sellout, that there've been tangible gains for Republicans. I think it's about, you've got to think about the audience that he is addressing there, whilst actually, I know that you might not buy into this, but actually the Provos were moving away from violence. Obviously, they used it tactically, in the mid-1990s. I remember vividly the Manchester bombing. I was in the city that day. They were determined to force entry into talks, but privately, the message, people like Story were sort of moving towards marginalising those who wanted to form the dissident groups. Which happened.
I understand that. John, I'm just going to sort of take you back into another area and this is something that I guess is very important to me this evening. I'm having you on, and this is the reason why I did ask you on. Well, you see, I mean, again, let's look at this concept of democracy. And whenever that you would place your axe on a ballot paper, and I'll just pop the particular ballot paper up here for people to see. And the commentary I would give here is that it was a referendum for the entire United Kingdom, as you can see. And it really asked the question, should United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? It didn't say, should Northern Ireland as a constituent part of the United Kingdom be broken away from the United Kingdom as a result? So most of us, and this is how democracy works, as you well know, and I'm not trying to tell you, a man that knows a lot about this here stuff, how things work. But I mean, if I place my axe here in the leave the European Union, and 17.4 plus million other people also done exactly the same, and we won the referendum, so to speak. Is it ever right? Now, this is a very serious question, and I'd like you to answer this really, carefully for me. But is it ever acceptable from an academic's point of view, from a professor of politics point of view, that democracy would be split up in the way that it was split up, and having, say, for example, there's 4 constituent parts, 3 constituent parts are treated differently than 1 constituent part? Why is that ever acceptable, John?
It's a great question, John, and it's a difficult one. It's a complex one to answer, because I get the premise of your question, and in many ways, I know where you're going with it, and I agree to a considerable extent. You asked remain or leave, and it didn't say but one part of the UK will leave on different terms to the rest of the UK. And that's where I think that the Loyalist protesters and the DUP and UUP are correct in opposing departure on different terms from the rest of the UK. But we also live in a world of pragmatism. Surely no one in the right mind wanted a hardening of the north-south border, given its political sensitivity. So you can argue that the EU played that border for all it was worth, the north-south border. And I would have, again, some sympathy with that argument. But we knew that was coming. I mean, even Theresa May in the referendum campaign said, she was raising the issue, what's going to happen to the border, the north-south border. This could be disastrous because it will create tensions. You can't really harden this border because part of the peace process was about softening that border. Obviously, the main softening of the border was to do with this EU single market. So instead, the tension was always going to lie elsewhere, whether you create another border elsewhere, at this east-west border that is in place. We don't know yet how significant that east-west border is. I would agree that the signs are not good early on. There's been shortages in supermarkets. There's been, firms unaware of what they've got to do. And if you're a Great Britain, investing in Great Britain, why would you be particularly interested in trading in Northern Ireland, given you've got this extra paperwork to complete? So I understand the annoyance of unionists. My argument would be, though, first of all, this was always likely to happen. And secondly, I think in constitutional terms, first of all, Northern Ireland has always been a place apart. We shouldn't pretend that Northern Ireland has always been an integral part of the UK. It had its own devolved government from the 20s until the 1970s, which was a very, very different form of governance from governance elsewhere in the UK. And you've had devolved governance again since 1998, which has been, episodic because it kept collapsing, keeps collapsing. So Northern Ireland's never been an integral part of the UK. It's part of the UK, but it's not an integral part. And so there's always been different treatment of Northern Ireland. And whether that leads to the ultimate expulsion of Northern Ireland from the UK, well, ultimately, there's 2 things to say. One, it's up to the people. The Good Friday Agreement says the Secretary of State can call a border poll. So it's up to yourselves within the North to decide. Secondly, it's up to the Assembly as to whether the protocol, which keeps Northern Ireland distinctive, aligned to the EU. The Assembly will decide. Now, I wouldn't have had the Assembly deciding. I would have had another referendum in Northern Ireland and let the people decide whether they like this distinctive set of arrangements. I get why you would argue against that, because you think, well, we've had a referendum, we voted to leave, and I get that. But I'd rather put it in the hands of the people again to confirm those arrangements rather than the Assembly. Yeah. It's a long-winded answer, I know, but it is a complicated question.
Yeah, I understand. And on this issue of democracy, I mean, technically, has democracy been corrupted as a result?
Corrupted is a strong word. I think that, again, I understand what unionists. I think what would really rile me if I was a unionist would be to hear Boris. I was at the DUP conference that day when Boris Johnson went in and brazenly whipped up the crowd.
Play the video and come back and talk about it. We've got this video.
Right. Okay.
Here,
Okay.
Boris Johnson one, and you can talk about it just for context for the people. And what I would like to say to the live chat is we're not ignoring you. I'm not ignoring you. I'll be bringing you on very, very shortly, and we'll ask some questions. So if you prepare some questions for John, and we'll seek answers to the best of John's ability. And thanks for staying with us. So back to Boris Johnson here for 2 seconds. Looking through my list. So here we go.
And we will be damaging the fabric of the Union with regulatory checks and even customs controls between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, on top of those extra regulatory checks down the Irish Sea that are already envisaged in the withdrawal agreement. Now, I have to tell you, no British Conservative government could or should sign up to any such arrangement. And so...
Over to you, John.
Well, exactly. I mean, he's condemned by his own words, because what he said no Conservative Prime Minister could or should do in 2018 at that conference. 1 year later, he went to the World Summit, it was called, with Leo Varadkar, and signed up to exactly, not quite the same, but effectively the same as what Theresa May had done. Basically, bespoke unique arrangements for Northern Ireland that keep Northern Ireland uniquely aligned to the EU and place customs and single market barriers between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, I thought the DUP were fools to be taken in by Boris Johnson, if they ever were, because he's always a man to keep at arm's length, be wary of. And there were a few DUP voices who were uneasy. I talked to them that day in the conference hall, who said, this guy's not to be trusted. But too many in the DUP went along with it. I think they were probably carried away by the fact they had the balance of power and thought that perhaps they were more powerful than they were, when, it's fine having the balance of power to get more money for Northern Ireland, get your extra billion. That was good, and the DUP negotiated well on that. But when you're up against 27 determined EU member states, that's a different ask. And when you've got Boris Johnson, who, they're at the DUP conference that day. What is he doing? He's launching. He's the first guy to actually launch a leadership bid at someone else's party conference. That's what he was doing. Playing to the Brexiteers, not just within the DUP conference hall, but Conservative Brexiteers. And yet a year later, he betrays them by what he does. The commentators were very suspicious of it at the time. I remember talking to Alex Kane after that speech. He was thinking, what's going to happen here? And sure enough, 1 year on, when it suited Boris Johnson, the DUP would drop like a stone. And that's where I get the anger within unionism and loyalism. But they were warned about this. They were warned that this was quite likely to happen.
Yeah. John, I think that you're making the argument for politicians, and this is music to my ears, but politicians to stick with the people and to stick with delivering to the people, for the people, and on behalf of the people, and not going off in their own different ways. John, I'm going to take you to something else now, representative democracy, as it's known. And again, you being the professor, I'd like some answers on representative democracy, what it is, and is it the right thing to be doing? I vote. Let's take it back to the 12th of December last year, 2019, where most of us rallied for the DUP. And we worked hard. We went around this Northern Ireland. We filled halls. We persuaded people to vote for the DUP, to give them the DUP their final last chance, their final last vote, was what we were having to persuade people with on many of occasion. And, shortly after the DUP, they got the vote. And I said, I've been on record as saying that we're only good for a vote. And whenever the vote is obtained, we don't matter until the next time that the vote is required. And, next time around, John, this is the sad thing about it, and it's not just for ourselves here in Northern Ireland, but certainly for conservatism right across the Western world, is the way that it seems to be happening, is that they take the vote and then they go off and they do their own thing. Now, I can recall, and I'm leading you in here with a question, but just a few years ago, there were people in the do you remember Boris and co? I think it was whenever Theresa May made a bit of a blunder, and then there was another. Remember, Theresa May thought she was going to go for a national or a general election and do well, and she didn't do so well. But the parties that did do well in and around that time were the people that took clear clear lines, and they says, well, look, we're for Brexit or we're completely against Brexit, as you well know. Representative democracy, is that something that is destroying conservatism, do you think, right now?
Well, again, it comes to how you define representative democracy. I mean, and what is the unit of democracy? You know, you had a UK-wide referendum. As a Brexiteer, you won it. You were in favour of Brexit. You won it, and it probably should have been implemented on a UK-wide basis. But there were pragmatic barriers to that. I'm glad that there wasn't a second referendum, whichever side of the debate you're on, because I don't really believe in having a second referendum just because you don't like the result of the first one. I think that undermines representative democracy. I would have a rule attached to any referendum, which is difficult because one sovereign parliament at Westminster cannot bind its successor. But I would attach a clause to any referendum saying that this result cannot be overturned until, I don't know, 15, 20 years. Because, I mean, otherwise you end up with these, never end them. It's like you've got in Scotland, the SNP, they lost in 2014, but want another referendum. And whether you're sympathetic to Scottish independence or not, I think simply trying to get another referendum because you don't like the result of the first is not a good way to conduct representative democracy. So, first of all, I would only use referendums as a form of representative democracy in the most urgent cases, and accept that Brexit was, had to be decided by a referendum. But I think people have got to abide by the rules. You win some, you lose some in referendums. You're not going to get your result you want all the time. But to simply start crying and trying to overturn it because you don't like the result, well, what's the point of having the referendum in the first place? I'm not sure that fully answers your question, but if that's where you were going, I agree that referendums can sometimes break logjams, but I think people have to abide with them. That's the good thing about the Good Friday Agreement. It says, I don't like the way that it's phrased about the Secretary of State alone should decide whether a border poll should be called. And there's no criteria specified as to it, other than when he thinks there's been a change in public opinion in Northern Ireland. Well, how's he going to measure that? But it does say that the result cannot be another one for a minimum of 7 years. So at least there's a time frame. Now, you can argue whether 7 years, whether it should be longer, so you have another one. But at least that is there. So at least there's clarity for people. They know, okay, which way I vote, there won't be another one of these for 7 years. I think it's probably a little short in terms of time, but at least it's there. I would attach that to any referendum.
Yeah. I think where I was going, and maybe clarify, was that it was the definition that David Cameron gave at the time with reference to Brexit referendum, when he said that there was going to be one vote, and there wasn't going to be another vote, there wasn't going to be a renegotiation. If the people placed their acts and they wanted to leave, we will be leaving the EU, is exactly what he said. And then when it got to the Parliament, in fact, the day after the vote went the wrong way, they were all, democracy doesn't finish now. And they started to try to redefine what they had already defined. And then they were telling us, well, we're saying, well, the people, it's the people's choice. And then they're saying, well, that's not how it works. It's representative democracy, and, the Parliament has to decide on this. And, it only serves, in my honest opinion, looking at it, and I guess that was the way that it was framing it, it serves to disconnect, to disenfranchise people, because they're saying, well, what's the point in voting whenever these people just go off and do their own thing anyway? And John, I say one thing with reference to democracy is, you see, democracy, I believe, from the bottom of my heart, and that's no matter why I win or I lose or I don't like the outcome, but I think that democracy is the single greatest asset that we as people have for settling societal contentions. And if we lose that as a means to settle some societal contentions, how's it going to be in the future? Are we going to see conflicts occurring here, there, and everywhere at some points in the future?
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more. In terms of referendum results, you have to abide by them. It's like, there'd be uproar if nationalists were to win a referendum on a united Ireland, and someone said, well, we'll have a second referendum or we'll try and overturn it. They'd obviously be outraged. That's why I really don't like, you had it in the South, although the Nice and Lisbon treaties were rejected in the South, and you can argue, well, better terms were then put to the people of the South, and that they were overturned in a subsequent referendum. I don't like the second referendum. In terms of Cameron never thought he would lose. That was Cameron had his near-death experience in Scotland, where he'd scraped home in 2014. He'd won an overall majority against the odds at the general election in 2015, and I think he thought he was untouchable by 2016. I mean, the Brexit business was party management gone horribly wrong, just trying to satisfy his backbenchers and see off UKIP. But the Labour Party was all over the place as well on Brexit. I think Jeremy Corbyn, I never really believed Jeremy Corbyn when he said that he voted to remain. He'd been a leaver for 30 years. He regarded the EEC as a capitalist club. And then Keir Starmer, I was at the Labour Party conference as an observer in Liverpool when Keir Starmer got up and basically tried to get the idea of a second referendum, potentially as Labour Party policy. So again, that's an example of people trying to potentially undermine referendum results, when you can argue the wisdom for sure of calling a referendum on Brexit, for sure, in 2016. But once the result came in, I don't think you could realistically overturn it. But the problem was, all it said was, do we remain or leave? It didn't say what our relationship with the EU would be on that ballot paper. And there is the problem with referendums. They are pretty crude binaries. In the same way, if you have a referendum on a united Ireland, if you have a border poll, it doesn't tell you on that ballot paper what a united Ireland would look like. Would you still have Stormont? Would you have devolution? How would you recognise British identity within United Ireland? So referendums, they're not great. They might look beguilingly simple. Let's settle this once and for all. But they don't. They're actually pretty straightforward, crude, but also crude questions for what is pretty complex. Because let's say there is going to be a united Ireland in the next 50 years. Well, what about the British identity? What arrangements would there be for the North within the United Ireland? Those things can't be dealt with on a simple yes/no. So that needs sorting out.
Yeah, definitely. John, we're going to move in the second part of the show. We're going to 9:30, and we're going to move in the second part of the show to talk about your book. And then we're going to talk about some things within Northern Ireland as they're happening right now. And then what we'll do is we'll go to some of the questions from the live chat. So what we'll do now is that, again, I'm going to pop up the picture of the book that John wrote. And John, whenever I pop this up on the screen, perhaps you would just like to tell us a bit about it and why it was that you set about, doing the research and scratching the surface with the individuals that you scratched the surface with.
Okay, yeah, abandoned historical conflict. It was Pete Shirlow, who's the director of the Institute of Irish Studies at Liverpool University. Myself and Jim McCauley, who's from a loyalist background, and Catherine McGlynn, we wanted to look at. You can certainly argue there's not been enough voice given to victims of the conflict, and I certainly would concur with that. There are books like Lost Lives, but we also wanted to know about prisoners, because if you look at Northern Ireland's prison population, there are no reliable statistics actually on how many went to the jails as a consequence of the conflict. But we calculated it was around 25,000. Most of those people, and this is not to exonerate or whitewash what went on at all, but most of those people would not have gone to jail if it hadn't been for the conflict. So first of all, we wanted to know what motivated them to get involved with the armed groups, but we wanted to know sort of more positively, well, do they still have the ideology with which they joined those groups, or having done time for what they did they see a way forward for reconciliation? And what we found was that most of them still had the same constitutional ambitions. They've not changed in terms of their constitutional outlook, but we found a lot of cordiality between loyalist and Republican prisoners, quite a bit of respect for each other. We had gatekeepers. So you mentioned that Billy Hutchinson spoke at the launch. So we had gatekeepers. I think Dawn Purvis, formerly of the UP, was gatekeeper for one of the gatekeepers for the UVF. We had people working with the UDA, and on the Republican side, Mickey Culbert was the gatekeeper to Koisture and the former Pyra prisoners. And we wanted to know, to what extent have you changed? Have you reflected on your ideology? Do you think that you were too extreme in your ideology? Do you what aspects of your ideology has changed? Because you still want a united Ireland, or you still want Northern Ireland to be part of the Union, but what compromises do you see? I mean, generally we were quite encouraged, I think, by the scope for compromise. there'd been quite a lot of mutual respect emerged amongst the former prisoners from within the jails, and that had carried on. And some of the biggest voices arguing for peace were those who had fought the war. And again, this is not to glorify or whitewash the needs of victims at all, but what we found was generally, even some of what we might describe as the toughest people in the jails, who ostensibly most hardline, had seen the need for compromise and flexible, not flexible constitutional solutions, but a need for coexistence, mutual coexistence, which they might not have seen during the conflict. And conflict does bring out the worst in people. You get sucked into this vortex of war, which can make otherwise rational human beings not always act in the finest ways possible. So, I think there was quite a lot of self-reflection. It also gave prisoners voice. We didn't want to impose our own meanings or definitions upon people. We wanted to give the prisoners voice for them to articulate what they felt without prompting. And obviously, in terms of, they could remain anonymous if they wished. If they wanted to be identified, they were identified. We gave them the choice in terms of anonymity or self-identification.
Yeah. Just as this is for yourself, but on Amazon this evening, whenever I was going to look for that cover, I noticed that it's sold out. So maybe you need to talk to the publishers and get some copies put in there.
That's testimony to Billy Hutchinson and Mickey Culbert's speeches on the night. It was also, it was gratifying to see just how many people turned up on the night. I remember launching it, and there were hundreds of people from both Republican and Loyalist backgrounds, freely mingling. And as I say, I think it was important to give them voice, because the state that imprisoned them isn't necessarily going to give them voice. Pete Shirlow is taking it forward in a sense, because he's been involved in some of the Fresh Start stuff, and he's tried to end discrimination against former prisoners in terms of their employment prospects. Now, don't get me wrong. I recognise the sensitivities of this. It's easy for an English academic who didn't suffer during the conflict to sit here and spout on that. There'll be victims out there who will be thinking, these guys should not be entertained at all. So I do understand the sensitivities, but the most difficult aspect to me, always, of the Good Friday Agreement was the prison releases. It was always going to be massively controversial. All I would say, and it's I recognise the difficulties of it, is there's not been a successful peace process anywhere across the globe, and I've written about this in the Comparative Peace Process book. It's always the most morally difficult aspect of any peace process, but there's not been a successful one anywhere in the world that has not involved prison releases. And it's really, really difficult, because how do you address the needs of victims, but also have a try and move on from the conflict? And I recognise that sounds glib. What was, I think, important about the Good Friday Agreement, was the clarity of the prison release scheme, because often they're ambiguous or they're very conditional. Everyone, provided the organisation remained on ceasefire, everyone was out within 2 years. That was one of the boldest aspects of the entire agreement, and obviously one of the most controversial.
Yeah. Whenever I was speaking to Billy Hutchinson on Friday evening, Billy Hutchinson, he was straight, he was open and honest in the way that he's seen it. And he says that Republicans, it would often been said from the British Unionist standpoint in Northern Ireland that, British Unionists seen this as a settlement, whereas Republicans seen it as a process and something to be agitated for. And today, in 2021, we still see that going on. So, John, I guess one of the questions that I'm going to ask you, and this was something that I posed to Professor John Brewer, and I know that John is also involved in, the victim aspect of the peace process, where what they're trying to do at the George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, attached to Queen's. They're trying to bring victims together. Now, we had a conversation, myself and John, probably 4 or 5 weeks ago, and it was on the victims. Now, I'm going to set you a bit of context here. Over the last number of months, I have, for example, on the anniversary of the Shankill bomb, we talked to a man that was very, very close to the events surrounding that day, and he's spoken on behalf of the victims, and we interviewed him, and it was a very powerful interview that we'd done that evening. And then we went on to talk to another lady called Aileen Quinton, which she was a victim. Her mother was killed in the Enniskillen bomb. So I had a chat with John Brewer not too long after that, and I'd asked John Brewer, in general, would he come on the show? And in fact, I did say that I would, whenever it was asking you to come on, I would have probably tried to bring the two years together. But after talking to you the other evening, I think that it's best that it's left separate so that we can talk to John Brewer on certain points, because John Brewer, as he said to me, profoundly disagrees with me. So, but it'll be a good interview. It'll be a good interview to have, because it'll let people see what it is that's driving, or certainly attempting to drive, the reconciliation process here in Northern Ireland. But one of the questions that I asked John Brewer at the time was that, he says to me, John, there are two different types of victims in his honest opinion. He identified those two groups. He says there's those people that want to forget, right? He says, and there's those people that will never forget. And, and I says, well, John, I'll add something else to that equation. And this is me leading to a question and leading into a place that we're taking the stream. But I says that, the people that we've been talking to, they want to forget, but they can't forget because they're not being permitted to forget. And that was your Aileen Quintons of this world, and that was the people like that was, the victims of the Shankill bomb, the living victims, the families. Whenever they see, for example, Peter Hain, Sean Kelly's license is revoked and he's put back in jail, and then Peter Hain comes along and gives him a get out of jail free card, and he says that it would be helpful to the peace process. I mean, that to me is like giving someone a hierarchy of rights. And that's the way that, any normal person would see it. And then there's from Aileen Quinton's standpoint, that's the Enniskillen bomb. I mean, she sees, for example, Bill Clinton coming and hailing Martin McGuinness as a hero of the peace. However, whenever you scratch the surface, and it doesn't take an Einstein to scratch the surface and see exactly what Republicans are doing in order to agitate. And they don't seem to take into account that there's victims that are alive today that they're traumatizing, and they're re-traumatizing them people. So again, I had asked John Brewer to take account of that third equation, whereby there's the people that want to forget, there's the people that don't want to forget, and then there's the people that are not being permitted to forget. And on that subject, I would just like to show you something. Whenever we talked to Aileen and the Shankill bomb people, and then we went off and had a chat with John. I mean, there's one particular case in Castlewellan in Northern Ireland here, and it's a sitting Sinn Féin MP, Chris Hazard, they call him. And, he has named his office after two dead IRA terrorists. Now, that might be, I don't know, some people think that's okay, and it's in it's in their own area and whatnot. But you see, not far away from where that office is, there's a man called Sammy Heenan. And Sammy Heenan lives maybe 5 miles away, and and he's livid at this, because that was the unit that made Sammy Heenan an orphan at the age of 11. When Sammy Heenan walked out 7 o'clock one morning and found his dad laying in the farmyard with gunshot wounds to the head, no 11-year-old should ever have to see that. And I'm going to go a wee bit further, but not only should no 11-year-old ever have to see that, but, no 11-year-old that has grown up to be a man should ever have to be reminded of that, and reminded of that in a way that that some people are glorifying the people that actually done that. So there doesn't seem to be the sensitivities, they don't seem to have any moral compass in terms of that, maybe we shouldn't be traumatizing these people. Maybe that if we did want to, as I say about, with reference there, and I'll just use this term loosely here, a united Ireland. Well, how did they ever expect to unite people if all they're doing is agitating against them and, creating divisions within society with that type of thing? So we'd just like to sort of pop up a picture of the office. That's the McNulty and the Megorian Advice Centre. Now, I know that you've written the book, John, the book that you just wrote, and this is a question on the back of what I've just shown you there. But In your honest opinion, whenever you were doing the interviews between the Republicans and the Loyalists, I mean, what was your measure of those people in terms of? I mean, I'm going to say from my standpoint, and I said this at the start of the stream, whenever I stood on the Shankill and I seen the Shankill bomb, I thought that this has to stop because people are the only people that suffer, and that's people on both sides. I mean, was there any measure of how those people felt? And I mean, were they wanting to put the past behind them? Are they playing bravado to their respective followers? Over to you, John.
I think they were torn. It's a great question. It's a really difficult question, and I'll try not to dodge it. I think that those prisoners that we interviewed, a lot of them were torn because they wanted the sacrifice of what they would term their volunteers to be remembered. And can you do that respectfully without alienating the other community who would regard, Shankill bomb or Enniskillen, and obviously as terrorism? Can you do it respectfully? Can you remember your own dead, respectfully without alienating the other side and naming play parks or advice centres or whatever, constituency centres after them? I don't think you can. I mean, there isn't a solution to this because living in the real world, Sinn Féin are not going to repudiate all the Provost did from 1970 until 1997. It's not going to happen. In the same way that loyalists will still commemorate those who, in some cases, killed innocent Catholics. It's simply not. There isn't a way of reconciling that. The only comfort we can take is that neither of those sides want to return to that violence. But politically, it's impossible for Sinn Féin to repudiate IRA violence during that era because probably they don't see it as wrong. They might see certain actions as wrong, because the IRA did apologise, for what it's worth, for civilian killings. You get all the whataboutery anyway. What about state killings and what about loyalist killings? So I don't think it's possible. No side is going to repudiate what they did. That's why I hate the term agreeing the past. You can't agree the past. For one side, it was terrorism. For another side, it was legitimate state actions trying to defeat terrorism. So you're not going to be able to agree the past. You can disagree the past, and the only thing you can agree on is that what happened was utterly terrible because thousands were dead and you had a society traumatized. That's as far as the agreement will go. So it's like a running saw, and I don't think you can have Storm at the House, you can have Fresh Start, you have Storm at the House, you can have all these legacy things. You're not going to agree the past. It's only until that generation dies off, I'm afraid, and then people can move on. You can learn from the past. You're not going to agree the past, and so I see it as a running saw which will continue to put, and I'm sorry to be gloomy, but bedevil Northern Ireland for another generation. But I just think, respectfully remember your dead, but don't glorify what was. Martin McGuinness said towards the end, he said, anyone who thinks there's anything glamorous about this war, as he termed it, is profoundly mistaken. And I think that actually was true. It's madness how would you celebrate you've got to remember that, more than half of the people killed in the conflict, slightly more than half, were innocent civilians. Right? Yeah. So you owe it to the memory of them not to glorify it, even if you're not prepared to repudiate the past. And I understand politically the different difficulties in doing that. It isn't going to happen. Loyalists are not going to repudiate what they did. Republicans won't repudiate what they did. But you've got to think about, always think. I think, before you do something, think about the victims, and then think, well, what would I do that would respectfully remember my own dead, but would not alienate victims? If you try and do that, we might get somewhere, but you'll never agree the past. Yeah. And, very few peace processes have done that. The only one was, I respect John Brewer because his knowledge of the South African process. That was rather different, in terms of the legitimacy of probably of the armed campaign plus they had an all-embracing Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But imagine a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Northern Ireland. It's been an idea that's been mooted, but you have to accompany it with amnesties. And even the Good Friday Agreement didn't give an amnesty. You can still be prosecuted for what goes on. So,
yeah. I mean, isn't there something right now, and I do appreciate what you've just said there, where there people that wrote for or give interviews to the Boston University, and they're now being charged with crimes as a result of that happening. So, John, this is the point of the show where we'll go over to some questions on the live chat. And please accept my apologies to the live chat for taking so long to get around to this here. But there were certain things that we wanted to ask John, in all fairness, and he didn't really do the right thing in terms of telling us that democracy is dead in Northern Ireland here right now. But anyway, so we'll maybe get that from him in the future. So Andrew Wickham had said, I'd like to ask John, if there was a referendum for the people in GB on Northern Ireland, should Northern Ireland remain part of the UK, what does he think of GB people would vote? As I feel a lot of people would like to see us gone, it would deliver their Brexit. Over to you, John.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think they probably would vote for Northern Ireland to leave. That's why I don't think it should ever happen, because I think it should be a matter of self-determination for people within Northern Ireland. As the Good Friday Agreement effectively sets it up as that, it should be for the people of Northern Ireland to decide on that. Yeah, I don't think, I mean, most people in Great Britain, a lot of them, I'd slightly differentiate, I would say this, wouldn't I, Liverpool and Manchester and parts of North West England, where I think there's quite a lot of interest in Northern Ireland. But, a lot of people in the home counties, they wouldn't be able to place Northern Ireland on a map. They don't care about it. They see it as a problem, and they gladly get shot of it. I mean, I remember during the Troubles, the Daily Mirror was regularly campaigning for the troops to come home, and British withdrawal from Northern Ireland would have happily been contemplated. Not because Daily Mirror was massively pro-Irish unification; it's just they wanted shot of the problem, and Northern Ireland's always seen as a problem. But it's not going to happen. I mean, the people of GB will not get the vote on whether to expel or keep Northern Ireland. It will be a matter for the people of Northern Ireland, which strikes me as, eminently fair. And I do think for Loyalists and Unionists, that was a big win, because remember that, the Republican war, if you want to call it that, was about Ireland being a single unit of self-determination. Republicans signed up to the consent principle within Northern Ireland in the Good Friday Agreement. That was a big shift. So that only the people of Northern Ireland could decide whether they stayed as part of the UK or not. Obviously, there'd be a separate vote in the South. I would expect the South to vote definitely for United Ireland. I think most opinion polls have shown that. If there was a referendum just purely in Northern Ireland, if there was a border poll called tomorrow, going slightly off piste here, but I have no doubt that people in Northern Ireland would vote to remain part of the UK. I think Republicans would lose a border poll, but they can have another one potentially 7 years later, and eventually they could get it over the line. But I don't. The evidence, the surveys that we have done and that others have done, like Northern Ireland Life and Times, suggest United Ireland's still some way off in terms of how the North would vote. I know some online surveys would disagree with that.
Yeah, John, I'm just looking through. There's lots of comments, but no real questions within the comments. And again, to the live chat, if there's any questions there, if you could just put them on the live chat, and what I'll do is I'll make sure they're put on the screen, and we ask John the questions that you ask. So I'm going to go over to something else here, John, and we're coming close to the close at 9:30. But John, thank you very much, and thank again the live chat. Thank you for coming on. And John, I hope that you're no stranger to coming on, because you see, sometimes when you can't get answers from your politicians, it's good to talk to people that are working really in the engine room of what's happening, and people that are around processes and understand full well what's going on. And I have to say, Billy Hutchison, it was a really good interview on Friday evening, and I would recommend that you go back and you look at it, and maybe some of your academics also look at it, because I spoke to Dave. Well, I sent Billy a message afterwards, and I was absolutely, I don't know, And even I know a man from a traditional unionist party here that's very, very rigid, that just had said to me, John, do you know something? He says, that's something, he says, that personally that I could work with, you know. It was open and it was honest and it was laying out where things really needed to go. But it wasn't about saying that, you know, that we can get everything that we want. It was about really telling the truth and saying that we need to do this, and this, and we don't really want to get into any agitation, you know. Now, Republicans will always agitate. I know that. I mean, we see that on a daily basis. And in fact, I smile whenever I continue to highlight their agitations. But that's what we expect from Republicans. So, John, this is for the people that's on the screen. It's going to put a smile on my face. It'll put a smile on your face too. And we're just going to go in a completely different route here right now. So I'm just going to play a video. You don't know what's going to happen here. And then when we come back, I'll ask you a question. John, I'm sure that brings back some memories from a time not too long ago when yourself and other people, we went and we watched the similar parade, and I have to say we had a very, very good day. And we were talking about, we were putting the world to rights, was the truth of the matter. But John, I mean, you told me
over several drinks, as I.
Oh, that's it. The Guinness was nice, and I think the gin was quite nice too. But as I'll say, I mean, you told me back in the day that, you know, you first you first came into contact with the marching bands and the Loyal Order fraternity at the age of 12. Would you just like to tell the listeners a wee bit about it, please?
Yeah, I mean, I lived in Southport, which is the top end of Merseyside, and every 12th of July, the Liverpool Orange Order, which is still, you know, a few thousand people, would come and march in Southport, and nothing else really happened in the 70s in Southport. It was sort of sleepy seaside town. So I was fascinated by this. Brought up a Catholic, and I didn't know. So I wanted to find out more about these people. So that's what got me really interested in religion, Sectarianism, the Northern Irish politics. You know, so I read as much as I could. As a consequence of that, that's what got me really interested. But I think what I realised was I'd been writing various books on Northern Ireland in the sort of late 90s and early 2000s, and I'd written stuff on the SDLP and Sinn Féin and general books on Northern Ireland. But I realised I didn't know, actually. You know, I didn't know. I was still talking crap, frankly. I didn't know or understand Unionists or Loyalists, and you can argue I still don't. But I wanted to find out a lot more about Unionism and Loyalism. So the projects that I've been involved in over the last decade, you know, sparked by that interest in the Orange Parade, all those years ago. We did a membership survey of the Orange Order, worked with them for 2 years, and they were great to work with. We did then a study of the DUP, the book From Protest to Power, worked with them for 2 years. They were great to work with. And the same with the UUP. We did a book on the UUP after that. And I do think over the last 10 years, that's following the book on Republican and Loyalist prisoners, you know, learn a lot more about, you know, what their hopes and fears are, what makes them tick, and understand about unionist politics. And so, one of the best things about academia is that you can challenge yourself, because I might have been brought up a Catholic who believed in a united Ireland, but I needed to challenge myself my own prejudices. And I think those projects, I'm not saying I just did them for therapeutic reasons, but I needed to know a lot more than I did about unionism, loyalism, orangism, call it what you will. And I think those projects at least have helped, so that, you're not just dealing with one side all the time. You're trying to think, well, how would the other side feel about that? And then the next project is actually dealing with Alliance, so we're working with them at the moment. So there's still a lot of work to be done. But I try and think, academia should be about trying to walk in other people's shoes and think about how they would feel. And I have to say, it's been some of the most rewarding years, because all of those organisations that I've just mentioned were absolutely great to work with. We were surprised when the DUP gave academic access, because they weren't a party noted for that. And fair play to Peter Robinson, who was the leader at the time, that he said it was access all areas. Good on them.
Yeah. John, one of the things that I'm going to say to you here is that, there's a lot of people, not just in Northern Ireland, in Ireland, in England, in Scotland, and in Wales, and across the Western world, where there is a disenfranchise from the political system, disengagement. And, people simply don't trust politicians. And, I fear for the future whenever that is the case. And whenever they look at some of the decisions that are taking place, even with that Brexit vote, where some people might just say, well, what's the point in voting? Because you don't even get delivered what it was that was meant to deliver, and you won the vote. But, is there something to be done with reaching out, John? And I'm asking you a question here, and maybe putting something in your head, but reaching out to those type of people to find what their concerns are. How bad is this disengagement? Will they ever go back to vote? Do they blame their political parties? Is there merits in maybe trying to do something along those lines to try to understand what it is that needs cured, and what politicians and political party machines need to deliver for and on behalf of those people that they've just disenfranchised?
Yeah, political disengagement, it's in different forms in different communities. But if you look, the loyalist working class would be politically disengaged because they think, even when they win, like Brexit, they feel they've lost. So I understand political disengagement. It's a question about what you do about it. In this case, I don't think there's no way the protocol is going to be changed in terms of Brexit. I just don't think loyalists will win. This is not 1985 and the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and the protests against that didn't work. It's not 1974 when loyalists did win by bringing down Sunningdale. So in terms of, first of all, political engagement, depends how you're defining it. And secondly, in terms of winning, it's really difficult, and that can leave people even more disillusioned. So, think back to recent protests. We talk about loyalists. The flags protest, we're never going to win. I understand why they did it, but they weren't going to win. So I think you've got to pick your battles. The broader issue of political engagement, though, the more, it's not healthy for Northern Irish society to have 2 out of 3 people between the ages of 24 who just can't be bothered going and voting at the last general election. Because don't tell me that general election didn't matter. It mattered big time. And yet they still, think of all the focus that there've been from 2017 to 2019, DUP holding the balance of power, Brexit, how it would affect Northern Ireland. That was a massive election. And yet 2 out of 3 still didn't think it was worth bothering to vote. That's a problem. It really is. And I can't wave a magic wand and solve it, but I think it's serious, and no one's addressing that. Why are young people, I think there needs to be a lot more research on why young people are so cheesed off with politics in Northern Ireland, because there simply hasn't been enough done on it.
Yeah, definitely. John, we're coming to a close, and at this point, I'm just going over the live chat again, and I'm going to thank the live chat for staying with us. And the numbers were good across the screens here that I'm looking at. And again, John, I would like to thank you for coming along, and please don't be a stranger. And John, this request is twofold, I would guess, is that, obviously, some people in academia and some people in good positions within politics. So this is me asking you that if you know anyone that could maybe feed into making Restore Live, Restore Northern Ireland, Restore GBNI a platform worth coming to for people, because it's always good to talk to the experts and talk to the people in political power. John, I would just like to ask you that please direct them our way, because this is what it's all about. It's all about really presenting to people what the reality is, because again, I'm going to go back to the Friday night interview with Billy Hutchison, and I have to say, even I come out of the back of that interview probably thinking in a different way. So these chats actually, they do good. They really do. Thank you, John.
I think that's right, John. And just to add to that, I think not blowing smoke up your backsides, but crudely. But I mean, when going on the 12 to Ballymoney and just sitting there having a drink with various people, I probably learned more that afternoon, even with the drink, than just talking to ordinary working class community and how they celebrate it. You learn more from that. Learn more of that from just reading or writing just the academic tombs. Just talking to ordinary people.
COVID
it was a great afternoon because I learned a lot.
That's good. COVID restrictions permitting, we'll be glad to have you back anytime, and that's the truth. And I always enjoy that place also. I live a long distance from Ballymoney in County Antrim, but some people say that it's like a land that time is forgotten, because the people, would you believe, John, that within that, and I think we were telling you that day, is that's Protestants and Catholics together enjoying the bands and the loyal institutions, and that happens where they mix together in the bars, and and that's how it is, that's how it should be, isn't it? That's the way life should be. John, thank you very much for
my pleasure.
coming on. Really appreciate that. And the live chat, thank you again for coming on. So there's going to be no rant tonight. What we're going to do is we're just going to close on a very positive note. That this has been a very positive stream with John. And again, I'll be lobbying John in the background. So if there's anything that the live chat wants me to lobby him on, well, you feed through to me and I'll feed through to John. But John, just on the question of Restore before we go, and then we'll close and we'll play us out with our theme tune. But Restore was chosen for a particular reason. Restore the middle ground, restore common sense within politics, restore the right of people to be listened to by their politicians. If you were to place Restore before any issue that you see today, what would you try to restore?
What I try and restore in terms of politics. Well, first of all, you've got to have permanent government. So the first priority is to actually make Stormont work. That's your first priority. Your local governance. Stormont has been down 45% of the time since the Good Friday Agreement. It's been a joke at times. It's been completely non-joined up government. So your first priority is to get an governing executive that will work. I mean, that's because ultimately if that collapses, where do you go? No one. I bet you don't want direct rule from Westminster, and I bet most of the population. Well, all the survey evidence shows it. So what you've got to do, if you're going to restore faith in politics, you've got to have governance that doesn't collapse as it did for 3 years. State of the NHS, when Storm went down in 2017, it was a disaster because long pre-COVID, you had by far the biggest health crisis anywhere in the UK, complete disaster. You had huge waiting lists for quite often urgent or urgent-ish treatments before COVID ever came. So what you're going to do is prevent future collapses of Stormont and build from there. That's the immediate priority.
Yeah, there's just one question, John, and you don't have to really get into it in depth, but it's just on a nutshell. What do you think of the concept of direct democracy? That's just one question for you.
Well, referendums are direct democracy. They can be very, very divisive, though. We saw that with the Brexit referendum. I think ultimately on constitutional issues, I think you've got to have direct democracy. So you couldn't have Northern Ireland placed into United Ireland without a referendum or direct democracy. So referendums under certain circumstances, fine, but I wouldn't extend it as a principle to day-to-day decisions. First of all, it's impractical to have direct democracy on every single issue. Secondly, what would you elect your political leaders to do? They are there to take tough decisions sometimes, not always popular ones, on your behalf. So direct democracy in terms of constitutional issues, yes, I believe in direct democracy. There's fundamental constitutional change with Brexit, unification pole, whatever, right? But not on how you run the NHS or stuff like that. You've got to have your leaders to do it for you.
Good stuff. And one more, it's not a question, certainly I'm going to tell you something, I'm going to ask you your opinion on it. You know, I mean, platforms like this, John, really it's about a platform for the people, of the people, and on behalf of the people. And that's not what we're getting in the mainstream media nowadays. So I believe there's a huge space within politics for platforms like this. But what we're seeing now across the Western world, if you don't have the right idea or the right politics, platforms like this are being taken down for no good reason by social media giants. John, would you have any thoughts on that? And is there any way in which that we can stop that from happening? I mean, we're doing no harm, as you can see.
Yeah, I mean, okay, it's a clear one for me. I'm against censorship. Unless someone is advocating violence, in which case I think you can do that. It's legitimate to remove the presence of someone who's advocating violence. But if they're not advocating violence, if they're simply disagreeing with you, then I don't believe in the removal of it. So let me take one example. You know, some people will be very pro lockdown under the current crisis. The majority are pro lockdown, but I wouldn't remove the voice of those who are against that. You know, and think there's a different way to deal with the health emergency. You know, because it's censorship. Like I say, as long as someone is advocating a view peacefully, they're entitled to advocate a view. I loathe censorship. One of the very few things that I'm proud of, that I try to follow people on Twitter who I disagree with, you know, quite a lot of the time, because, you know, you want to be challenged. What's the point? I hate Twitter at times because it's just an echo chamber or a pile-on against certain people or certain views. I don't believe in removing people from social media, unless, like I say, with that exception, that they are advocating violence against another person or persons. That's where I would draw.
Yeah. On that subject, and then we're playing ourselves out, no rants today, but I would like to say to the people on the screen, and I guess the people that will come on the back of you being here, John, and this is a message to those people in places of influence, but, you know, wouldn't it be good if there were laws made that your belief, your culture, your way of life, your lifestyle, and your lifestyle choices, wouldn't it be good if it was made that they should be implemented in a way that they have no interference in anyone else's way of life? And I believe that there should be laws put in place to ensure that that doesn't happen. And I mean right across the board. So, John, thanks very much for coming on. Thanks to the live chat. John, don't go anywhere for a second. I'll just play us out with this theme tune, and then sure I'll have a chat to you in the background. In fact, if you want to go off, sure, I can messenger you. But thanks very much, John. Thank you.
Cheers. My pleasure, John. Okay.
Just across the Irish Sea stirs a heart of loyalty, raised honor and dignity, drives a will to keep us British free. Not alone are we on this journey, we're in a land just across the sea. It's a hand that reaches out of friendship, and a bond that's lasted centuries. And its hands cross the water, reaching out for you and me, for Queen Ulster and for Scotland, help to keep our loyal people free. Let the cry be no surrender, let no one doubt our loyalty. Reaching out to the brave red hand of Ulster is the hand across the sea. its hands across the water, reaching out for you and me, for Queen and Ulster and for Scotland, help to keep our loyal people free. Let the cry be no surrender, let no one doubt our loyalty. Reaching out to the brave red hand of Ulster is a hand across the sea. Just across the Irish Sea stirs a heart of loyalty, raising honor and dignity. Thrive the will to keep us British free. Not alone, we on this journey, or in a land just across the sea. It's a hand that reaches out in friendship. It's the hand across the sea. It's the hand across the sea. It's a hand